In cities from Cairo to Istanbul, some of the grandest buildings did not technically belong to any ruler, merchant, or family. On paper, they belonged to God. Their rents and harvests paid for fountains, schools, hospitals, and soup kitchens that fed thousands every day. Yet the same pious machinery quietly protected elite fortunes from taxes, confiscation, and even their own heirs. This is the story of the Waqf, the Islamic charitable endowment, a form of devotion that became one of history's most powerful tools for organizing property. And it raises a sharp question. When is charity really charity? And when is it a beautifully legal way to lock up wealth forever? Welcome to the untold economy, where money, power, and belief quietly rewrite how societies work. Picture 16th century Istanbul, capital of the Ottoman Empire. The call to prayer rolls across domes and minarets. A stone fountain pours clean water into brass cups, free to anyone passing by. A modest building next door serves a daily meal to the poor. A school and a small hospital sit nearby, their doors open, no payment required. None of this comes from a municipal budget or a modern welfare state. The salaries, bread, oil for lamps, and even the soap in the hospital are paid from income produced somewhere else, from villages, shops, baths, orchards, and caravans that have been locked into a legal black box called a waqf. A waqf begins with a founder. It might be a sultan, a court official, a trader, or a widow with a few shops in the bazaar. They go to a judge and declare, this property is now dedicated to God. Its income will forever support this mosque, this school, this fountain, these specific people. The judge records a deed, witnesses sign, and from that moment the asset is frozen. In Islamic law, that property has left the world of normal commerce. It cannot be sold, inherited, or mortgaged in the usual way. Jurists would say the ownership now belongs to God. Humans only manage the benefits. The founder appoints a trustee, often a family member, and the deed specifies in careful detail who gets what, how much the imam is paid, how many loaves must be baked, how many students receive stipends. Religious courts enforce these rules. Economically, it is simple. Imagine a row of rental shops endowed as a waqf. Tenants pay rent. The trustee uses that rent to pay teachers, repair the building, and distribute leftover cash as alms. The capital, the shops themselves, stays intact. If maintained, it can supply services for centuries. Multiply this logic thousands of times. In some parts of the Ottoman Empire, historians estimate that a huge share of urban real estate and a major fraction of cultivated land ended up in waqfs. In practice, a large chunk of the economy sat inside a parallel, religiously protected sector, governed by judges rather than finance ministries. Why did people pour so much into this system? On the surface, the answer is spiritual. In Islam, charity is a core obligation, and funding a waqf that supplies water, education, or care is seen as ongoing charity, a good deed that keeps counting after death. Endowing a fountain in a dusty city or a hospice on a pilgrimage route felt like investing in salvation. But the Waqf also solved very worldly problems. First, it was a shield against the state. Pre-modern rulers, from Abbasid caliphs to Mamluk sultans, often seized wealth when they needed money or when a powerful official fell from favor. A property turned into a waqf was much harder to confiscate. It was protected by religious courts and by the moral force of funding public good. To attack a waqf was to attack God's own real estate. Second, it was a way around Islamic inheritance law. By default, the Quran divides an estate among a wide circle of heirs. That makes it harder to keep big fortunes intact. But if a magnate transformed his properties into a family waqf, he could channel the income to a narrow line of descendants and send a slice to charity. On paper, this was pious. In practice, many family waqfs looked a lot like modern trusts, vehicles to concentrate wealth, avoid fragmentation, and reduce taxes. Here is the deeper irony. The more elites used waqfs to shield wealth, the more the state came to rely on waqfs to provide public goods. Across the Islamic world, waqfs built and maintained much of the civic infrastructure. They funded schools that trained jurists and scribes, fountains that kept neighborhoods alive, caravanserais that anchored trade routes, and hospitals that treated the urban poor. Rulers leaned into this. Ottoman sultans and their families created vast waqf complexes, mosques surrounded by kitchens, libraries, baths, and markets. These were acts of piety, but also of soft power, projecting imperial generosity into every district they touched. Think of it as a mixed system. The formal state budget focused on armies and high politics. The Waqf sector, decentralized but legally standardized, handled a large share of what we would now call social spending. Of course, not everyone was happy. Finance officials complained that too much land was locked away from regular taxation. Urban reformers argued that old endowments became rigid. A 13th century deed might still dictate 18th century spending in a city that had completely changed. Heirs excluded from family waqfs sued in court. Ordinary people grumbled when corrupt trustees siphoned off income. In the 19th century, pressure for change intensified. Modernizing rulers like Egypt's Muhammad Ali moved to seize or reclassify Waqf property to strengthen their own fiscal base. The late Ottoman Empire created a ministry of Awqaf to regulate and sometimes centralize these endowments. European colonial regimes, from the French in North Africa to the British in India, introduced new laws and bureaucracies to supervise or reshape waqfs, often casting them as obstacles to efficient markets. Bit by bit, the old Waqf universe was dismantled or transformed. Some properties were nationalized into state schools and hospitals. Others became modern charities under tighter state control. In many countries today, Awqaf still exist, but as regulated foundations, closer to nonprofit corporations than untouchable sacred trusts. Yet the underlying logic feels familiar. Consider a modern university endowment. Donors give capital to a legally separate entity. That capital is invested. Only the income is spent, according to a charter that reflects donor intent. The institution is tax privileged. A board of trustees, not the state, decides how the money is used, often in perpetuity. Or think of large private foundations. They fund research, education, and health programs, but also cement family names and shape public priorities without going through elections. They are common tools in tax planning for the ultra-wealthy. Their leaders talk about impact. Their critics talk about power. Across cultures, when elites want to turn wealth into influence without losing control, they reach for similar legal technologies, endowments, trusts, foundations. They promise eternity to donors and stability to beneficiaries. They live in the gray space where generosity, strategy, and authority meet. What made the Waqf distinctive was the way belief hardened it. Because these endowments were anchored in religious law, backed by judges and scholars, they came to feel untouchable. Property wasn't just owned, it was sacralized. That sacralization constrained rulers, but it also constrained change. There are a few lessons here. Charity is never just about kindness. It is also a way of structuring property, deciding what can be taxed, what can be sold, and who gets to decide. When we talk about foundations and endowments today, we are also talking about deep design choices in the economy. Belief matters. Medieval Muslims trusted the Waqf partly because they trusted the religious scholars and courts that governed it. Today, we place a similar faith in legal charters, nonprofit status, and the word philanthropy. In both cases, legitimacy hides a lot of power, and outsourcing public goods to private endowments can build impressive infrastructure. But it can also weaken the state's capacity and skew priorities toward what donors care about. The question of who funds the common good and under what rules has never been neutral. So when you pass a gleaming university funded by $1 billion endowment or read about a foundation reshaping global health, you're walking through a very old debate in new clothes. How much of our shared future should be built from capital that has been frozen, shielded, and entrusted to private visions of the public good? The Waqfs that once dotted the Islamic world have largely lost their legal aura, but their blueprint lives on in our own institutions. God's real estate portfolio was never just about heaven. It was a way of drawing the line between wealth and welfare on earth. If this gave you a different way to see foundations, faith, and the hidden life of property, consider subscribing to the Untold Economy. History doesn't repeat, but its legal inventions do, quietly shaping the world we think is normal.